For this week, I've decided to kind of do a sidestep and talk more about understanding the idea of ethics. The first stem, the assessment, excuse me, that we did a couple weeks ago, it became clear to me that I had made some assumptions in our general understanding of ethics to begin with. In talking about, what ethics does Paul Harvey bring to the whole concept of um, God and Ram trucks, right, with what was going on there. And so I decided to come back and revisit this. Especially, this is especially important that we understand before we really launch into the Russian reach and the persuasive ethics and infractions that are involved with that. That we have a little bit better framework for that. Especially on the heels of what you just read last week as well. I'm hoping that you've read the Rand, the second chapter of that Rand PDF document, as well as getting into a little bit of the background of Cambridge Analytica. That's setting us up on the Russian side, but still, I think we need a little bit more discussion here in terms of the ethics side. Now, most of you responded to the idea of ethics from a standpoint of ethos, and certainly that's the etymology of the term ethics. But it goes beyond the credibility of the orator or the rhetor that way, or the propagandist for that matter. Ethics comes into a prescribed standard of behavior, and I want to establish that with you here within this clip, especially as we get into political standards, political ethical standards as well. So bear with me with this as we go along. When I talk or think about the idea of ethics, this guy comes to mind. His name is Dan Rather. You might not know him. When I was in journalism school, Dan was my idol. Probably one of the foremost prolific and hardest working journalists to come along, especially in television journalism. His works in particular with the Vietnam War and what happened after that, and with Watergate. Very few people have made such an impact on television journalism, maybe to transcend him. Walter Cronkite, certainly, Edward R. Murrow, but that's about it. Okay. And Dan Rather was a regular fixture on CBS's 60 Minutes, and then when they broke it out to 60 Minutes too, Dan Rather was one of the producers and the anchor on that. And that's where he got into a little bit of trouble with something called the Killian documents. Now, this was a controversy that involved these documents that were critical of the president at the time, who was George W. Bush, and his service in the Texas Air National Guard in 1972 and 1973. And these documents kind of supported the story that Dan Rather was getting into in his criticism of President Bush. Four of these documents were presented as authentic on a 60 Minutes 2 broadcast that was aired by CBS on September 8th in 2004. Less than 2 months, before the 2004 presidential election. And it was later found out that CBS failed to authenticate these documents. And so as a result of that, there was a typewriter and a typography study that concluded that the documents were actually forgeries. There was no forensic document examiners or typography experts have authenticated the documents. And this really led to the downfall of not only Dan Rather's credibility, his ethos, but also his ethics in presenting information that he had not yet vetted. And that was problematic for him. In fact, so problematic that that was the end of his career. So let's get into maybe some ethical perspectives. There are a number of different categories that we can study to go through and maybe codify some concept of ethics, or at least our approaches, human nature, the political arena, situational ethics, legal ethics, dialogical ethics. Let's get in the first one, this idea of human nature. And you know what? We could spend an entire semester just on this one alone in Persuasion. It's not going to happen with me, but who knows? Someday, perhaps we can look at something that's that focused. And what comes to mind here for me is this little movement that started here a couple of years ago. Remember that? Hashtag Me Too? I'm hoping you do. In fact, I'm hoping it's still somewhat forefront in your mind. Well, this came about by this guy, a certain monster by the name of Harvey Weinstein. In October of 2017, the New York Times and the New Yorker reported that dozens of women had accused Weinstein of rape, sexual assault, sexual abuse over a period of at least 30 years. Okay? More than 80 women in the industry have since accused Weinstein of the same kind of thing. And he denied any non consensual sex, of course, like most monsters do. And shortly after that, he was dismissed from the Weinstein Company, which is a huge entertainment company in Hollywood. He was expelled from the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts, and Sciences, and all the other professional associations. And he vanished. He disappeared from public view. Then they started to investigate what was going on from at least 6 women that in Los Angeles, in New York City, and in London, and this was ongoing. And then on May 25th, last May, he was arrested in New York, and he was charged with rape and other offenses, released on bail. The persuasive nature of this, of his human nature here, is where this gets pretty, well, the whole thing's deplorable, okay? But to go through and say, well, it was all consensual, no non-consensual sex happened, that they all just wanted a part in a movie, or however he decided to spin that, gets into ethical infractions of persuasive rhetoric. He went so far as to have his own legal counsel take over the particular female target that he abused, and they would go through and do everything they possibly could to persuade that victim to not come out against Weinstein. This is how prolific his abuse was, is that he had an entire legal team complete with special investigators to go through and strong-arm these women to not say anything else. They would go through and ruin their career. They would go ruin their reputation, whatever might happen at that point. It was pretty amazing. So this led to the hashtag Me Too movement. The scandal's impact on powerful men in various industries came to be called what's called the Weinstein effect. So human nature has a tendency to go through and say, well, how much can we get away with? What kind of persuasive rhetoric can we use to get away with the deplorable actions that power and wealth might have afforded us at some point? Pretty incredible. Next is the political approach, and gosh, where do I start on this one? Well, how about this guy, George Papadopoulos? Almost 5 months after the special counsel officially began their work, Mueller filed his first charge accusing this guy, who was the foreign policy advisor to our current president, of lying to the FBI. And according to Mueller, Papadopoulos told an Australian diplomat in 2016 that Russia had dirt on Hillary Clinton long before the Democratic candidate's internal campaign emails started to leak online. And part of this plea deal with Mueller, Papadopoulos admitted that he discussed his Russia contacts with top campaign officials, okay, and then including a meeting between Trump and Putin, Russian President Vladimir Putin. Or how about this guy? His name is Paul Manafort. And he was eventually convicted on 8 different counts of tax and bank fraud, and later pled guilty to committing a conspiracy against the United States and a conspiracy to obstruct justice, all in the name of a certain presidential campaign. Or how about this guy, Michael Flynn? He served a brief 24 days as Trump's national security advisor, and he admitted that he lied to federal investigators under oath. And this is a guy who takes his oath seriously, okay? Under oath about conversations that he had with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak during the transition about sanctions that President Obama had just imposed on Russia for its interference in the 2016 elections. And then he entered a plea deal with Mueller. Or how about this guy? Or how about this guy, Michael Cohen? Or how about this guy, Samuel Patton? Or how about this guy, Roger Stone? I don't want to take up a whole lot of time going through and talking about the idea of political persuasion and the infractions that go on. But you know what? Man, we are surrounded by a dearth of instances of things like this that are going on. I'll get back to this here a little bit later on. I'm tired of talking about these clowns. So let's get into this idea of situational ethics. And we are all caught up on these on some level. We're caught up whether or not we have an opportunity to cheat on a test, or to fudge a tax document, or to go through and so we see somebody drop a credit card. I saw it happen this morning. Guy drops a credit card in Einstein Bagels and he walks away. And I could have, but I didn't. I stopped him and said, hey, you dropped your credit card. Situational ethics. And within that situation, we all play some kind of a role. With that role, there are some level of expectations that go along with that. Even just being a simple human being, there's some expectations that go along with that, okay? And then there's an awareness of the situation. That's context. Remember that? Physical, psychological, social, cultural, temporal. What are all the things that are coming together within this that start to create their own situational ethics within that? What do they have in common as well? What do we have in common with each other within that type of situation? In the terms of the temporal context, is it something that we address immediately? Do we wait and see what's going to happen? All kinds of questions that come into play here. And lastly is this concept of standards. Well, here's a situation for you. So this is Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. And just yesterday, so today is the 17th of February? Saturday. The Vatican defrocked him, making him the highest-ranking church official to date to be expelled from the priesthood. And you guessed it, for sexual abuse. The tribunal found McCarrick guilty of, quote, solicitation in the sacrament of confession and sins against the Sixth Commandment with minors and with adults, with the aggravating a factor of the abuse of power. This is according to the Vatican. Pope Francis has approved the ruling, and there's no possibility of appeal. So, the whole concept here of the ethics involved, the situational ethics, let me go back to those if I can. Is this going to allow me to do it? Go back. No, it's not allowing me to do it. Okay. Dang it. Okay, bear with me. Okay, now we're at this. The role this guy played, he was a cardinal, and along with being a cardinal, he's a confidant. He's somebody to whom they go to in confession. He is supposed to be a safe individual. And you know what? This is so stereotypical anymore. This is played out so many hundreds, if not thousands of times that I don't know why we're still surprised by it, but we are. There's certain expectations that go along with the role of the cardinal, obviously. The heightened awareness of what's happening with men of the cloth and what's going on with certain sexual abuses that way. The commonality here, this one, if we are Catholic or if we profess a faith and we have that faith within certain clergy and the leadership of that, then there's some common persuasive ethics involved within this. This happened over the course of decades, okay? And of course, it's a violation of standards of the Vatican, okay? That's how this becomes situational, and that's how they end up applying to the former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick. Next is legal. And probably the most pertinent example we can give here is our most recent declaration of a national emergency. And there have been many who have tried to go through and discredit the legality of this. But really, in all actuality, the existing president has constitutional and legal precedents to go through and call for that national emergency. Now, what's at question here in terms of its ethics is how this state of national emergency circumvents one of the most important constitutional checks that we have on presidential power. And that's the power of the purse, the power of Congress to raise and spend money. And that's a constitutional power given to Congress. It's not given to the president. But the president can go through and usurp that power based on this declaration of a national emergency. And that all depends on whether or not we are actually dealing with an emergency. Lastly is one that's kind of difficult maybe to understand, but it's really pretty simple, and it deals with what's called the dialogical approach. The dialogical approach really is just it's a story, and anybody who uses any kind of an anecdote to go through and get their point across or to persuade somebody is using a dialogical approach. It's dialogue, okay? It's a story. And within a story, there are two things that exist. One is this idea of noise, okay? The other one is the idea of message. What does the rhetor create in terms of noise as opposed to what the message of the story actually is? How do we balance those two things out? So you might remember this little boy. His name is Amran Dakhnish. And he happened to be in an apartment building with his family that got bombed by Assad's regime in Syria. Okay, and they pulled him out of the rubble, and they got him in the back of this ambulance. And there happened to be a videographer there who was able to go through and videotape this whole thing. What you're looking at here is a frame from that. Okay, and so this is quite a story. I mean, look at this poor child. Look at the blood on his face, and he's completely encrusted with the dust of this building. He just lost his brother as well. And yet, the charge was made from a dialogical standpoint in terms of persuasive ethics. The charge was made against the videographer who was using this boy to go through and promote a political message. In fact, the boy's father, who was sympathetic to Assad and his regime, turned around and tried to sue the AMC for using this image. Okay? So what are the agendas and what it is that we see given within certain perspectives, certain story perspectives, especially in journalism with what's going on? So all this comes together, as we talked about last week, and can be used to go through and create propaganda. We talked about 3 different characteristics of propaganda. I want to go through and maybe get through those just a little bit more detail. The first one being that propaganda is ideological. And honestly, how do we find ideology? And this was another item on the test that a number of people struggled with at the end. What ideologicals were played with, worked hard in getting people to buy a pickup truck. Well, the ideologies were religion and patriotism. The very first image we see within that Dodge commercial is the image of a chapel, of a church. And then we see a number of images as well with people praying, a family praying at the dinner table. All of these hark back to the ideological concept, not to mention that Paul Harvey's saying that, well, God made the 8th day for farmers, kind of a thing. I'm not sure if that fits into a Judeo-Christian calendar. You get the point. Okay. Other ideologies within that spot was the American flag and the whole concept of patriotism going on. So understand that propaganda really focuses on certain strong convictions, ideologies that really are very difficult to go through and change, but they become the targets here of persuasion. That rhetoric is mediated, and I'm not talking by an attorney or something. I'm not talking mediated through channels of media. Social media is our highest mediated persuasive channel we have got going on out there because of how ubiquitous it is. It's cheap, doesn't cost anything to go through and become or to submit propaganda out there for consumption. And everybody's going to pick it up on some level, and they're going to share it. They're going to put it out there. Propaganda has a covert agenda. We're not going to really tell you why we're doing what we're doing. We're just going to make you feel really good about it. In fact, we're going to make you think that it's your idea. Propaganda has some level of uniformity in its message, where we might have different messages that are reaching different audiences, but the message theme remains the same. It's very uniform. And it's also highly repetitive. We see it over and over and over again. And obviously, propaganda goes through and extorts emotion there. Now, all these things all these concepts come together and create a remarkable. What am I trying to say? The propagandist who comes up with these kinds of things turns into this term, what's called a demagogue. And we have a number of demagogues who are very active, and we have our history books are rife with these kinds of things. But I wanted to go through and give you a definition of this. And keep in mind, this definition existed long before our current administration. So a demagogue wields a mass leadership, a popular leadership over a huge amount of people. They exert their influence through their rhetoric, through their personal rhetoric that they're putting out there, not the least of which are tweets, right? They rely on suggestion, perhaps from a certain news source. They use scapegoating. They have irrelevant emotional appeals. There's a pseudo-proof to bypass critical thinking, a total discounting of intellectuals, for example. We don't need those. We don't need intellectuals to tell us what's going on. We know what's going on, right? The demagogue capitalizes on hot social issues. In fact, they'll use hot social issues to go through and distract from the even hotter political issues that might be involved in the limelight. They hide certain agendas within social causes where real interest is their own personal gain. Holy ham, does any of this sound familiar to you? And again, this list existed long before we got into our current administration. And in fact, long before most administrations, this kind of thinking started to evolve a little after the Russian Revolution, as we get into it. So, with this definition of a demagogue, it's critical for us to understand how to go through and evaluate certain persuasive messages through some level of ethical standards for political persuasion. So there are 11 standards here I'm going to go through. Let me go through these quickly so I'm not taking too long, and then I have a little activity for you to do here for this week. First, don't use false, fabricated, misrepresented, distorted, or irrelevant evidence to support arguments or claims. Don't intentionally use spacious, unsupported, or illogical reasoning. Don't represent yourself as informed or as an expert on a subject when you are not. Don't use irrelevant appeals to divert attention or scrutiny from the issue at hand, such as smear attacks or appeals to hatred and bigotry, innuendo, and emotionally loaded terms that cause intense but unreflective reactions. Don't ask your audience to link your idea to emotion-laden values, motives, or goals to which it is actually not related. Don't deceive your audience by concealing your real purpose or self-interest, the group you represent, or your position as an advocate of a viewpoint. Don't distort, hide, or misrepresent the number, scope, intensity, or undesirable features of consequences or effects. Don't use emotional appeals that lack a supporting basis of evidence or reasoning, or that would not be accepted if the audience had time and opportunity to examine the subject themselves. Don't oversimplify complex situations into simplistic two-valued, either-or polar views or choices. Don't pretend certainty where tentativeness and degrees of probability will be more accurate. And lastly, don't advocate something in which you do not believe yourself. So for this week, I'm going to ask you to pick one of these standards, and find where that standard was violated, and then post that in a discussion thread. And, well, look up the discussion thread to see what other expectations that are within that activity for this week. All right? If you have any questions, you know where to find me.